Imagine discovering that your neighbor, a kind baker who has never harmed anyone in his life, has been arrested by church authorities and subjected to weeks of systematic torture using devices specifically designed to inflict maximum pain without causing death. His crime wasn't murder, theft, or treason. He was accused of secretly practicing witchcraft based on nothing more than an anonymous accusation from someone who owed him money. What makes this scenario even more horrifying is that this wasn't an isolated case of corruption or sadistic abuse, but part of a carefully designed legal system that deliberately tortured innocent people as a standard procedure for determining guilt or innocence. For over 6 centuries, courts across Europe operated under the assumption that torture was not only acceptable, but absolutely necessary for uncovering the truth, leading to the systematic brutalization of hundreds of thousands of people who had committed no crimes other than falling under suspicion in societies where paranoia and religious extremism had replaced rational investigation. The fundamental premise behind medieval and early modern torture was the deeply flawed belief that physical pain could force people to reveal hidden truths that they would otherwise conceal, making torture seem like a scientific method for discovering facts rather than a form of systematic cruelty. Legal scholars and church authorities developed elaborate theoretical frameworks that portrayed torture as a necessary tool for justice, arguing that the temporary suffering of individuals was justified by the greater good of protecting society from hidden enemies and secret crimes. This wasn't primitive barbarism, but sophisticated institutional thinking that convinced some of history's most educated people that inflicting agony on suspects was not only morally acceptable, but professionally required for anyone seeking to serve justice effectively. The Inquisition represented the most systematic and widespread application of torture to innocent people in human history, operating under the terrifying principle that anyone could be guilty of heresy regardless of their outward behavior or public statements. Inquisitors genuinely believed that secret heretics posed such a grave threat to Christian society that any method of identifying them was justified, no matter how many innocent people might suffer in the process. The torture sessions weren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully planned investigations conducted according to detailed manuals that specified exactly which devices should be used, how much pain should be inflicted, and what types of confessions should be extracted from different categories of suspects. The economic motivations behind widespread torture reveal how financial incentives created powerful pressures to find people guilty regardless of their actual innocence or guilt. When the property of convicted heretics was confiscated by church or state authorities, torture became a profitable enterprise that generated enormous wealth for the institutions that practiced it. Innocent wealthy merchants, landowners, and craftsmen became particularly attractive targets because their torture and conviction would result in substantial financial gains for their accusers. This created a perverse system where economic success made people more likely to be accused of crimes, while the torture process was designed to guarantee confessions that would justify the seizure of their assets. The psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to participate in torturing their innocent neighbors reveal how social pressure, religious authority, and institutional conditioning can override basic human empathy and moral reasoning. Torturers weren't necessarily sadistic psychopaths, but often ordinary citizens who had been convinced that their actions served God, justice, and community safety. They were taught to view the screams and suffering of their victims as evidence that evil was being purged from the community, while any expressions of innocence or pleas for mercy were interpreted as proof that demonic forces were trying to protect their servants from righteous punishment. The role of confessions extracted through torture demonstrates how the legal systems of the time had completely abandoned any genuine interest in determining actual guilt or innocence in favor of confirming predetermined assumptions about the prevalence of hidden crimes. Torture was specifically designed to produce confessions rather than to uncover truth, with the devices and techniques being calibrated to break down human resistance while keeping victims alive long enough to admit to whatever crimes their torturers wanted to hear about. The fact that people would eventually confess to anything under sufficient torture was well known to the authorities who employed these methods. But rather than seeing this as evidence of torture's unreliability, they interpreted it as proof of its effectiveness in forcing evil people to reveal their true nature. The targeting of specific demographic groups for torture reveals how these practices served to reinforce existing social hierarchies and eliminate people who challenged established power structures. Women, particularly those who were elderly, unmarried, or economically independent, were disproportionately accused of witchcraft and subjected to torture designed to confirm their supposed guilt. Jews, Muslims, and members of other religious minorities faced systematic torture campaigns aimed at forcing conversions or eliminating their communities entirely. Poor people, social outcasts, and anyone who had conflicts with local authorities were also frequent targets, as their torture served to demonstrate the consequences of challenging the established order. The development of increasingly sophisticated torture devices reveals how technological innovation was systematically applied to the problem of maximizing human suffering while maintaining the victim's ability to provide confessions. The rack, the thumbscrew, the Iron Maiden, and dozens of other devices were carefully engineered to cause specific types of pain that would break down psychological resistance without causing immediate death. Master craftsmen were employed to design and build these instruments, while detailed instruction manuals were written to ensure that torturers could operate them with maximum effectiveness. This wasn't crude brutality, but scientific cruelty that applied engineering principles and medical knowledge to the systematic infliction of pain. The religious justifications for torturing innocent people were extraordinarily sophisticated, drawing on complex theological arguments about the nature of sin, divine justice, and the relationship between physical suffering and spiritual purification. Church authorities taught that torture could serve as a form of purgatory that would cleanse the souls of the accused while protecting Christian society from the corrupting influence of hidden evil. They argued that innocent people who died under torture would be immediately transported to heaven as martyrs, while guilty individuals who confessed would have the opportunity to achieve salvation through repentance. This theological framework allowed torturers to view their work as acts of mercy and spiritual service rather than criminal brutality. The bureaucratic systems that supported widespread torture demonstrate how institutions can systematize cruelty and make it appear routine and legitimate through careful organization and documentation. Detailed records were kept of every torture session, including descriptions of the devices used, the duration of the sessions, the nature of the confessions extracted, and the ultimate fate of the victims. These records were maintained not as evidence of abuse, but as proof of the thorough and professional nature of the investigations being conducted. The bureaucratization of torture made it possible for thousands of people to participate in systematic brutality while maintaining their sense of moral legitimacy and professional competence. The international spread of torture techniques reveals how knowledge about inflicting pain was actively shared between different institutions and regions, with innovations in torture technology and methodology being communicated through official correspondence and training programs. The Spanish Inquisition's methods were studied and adopted by authorities throughout Europe, while Islamic and Asian torture techniques were incorporated into Christian practice through cultural exchange and military conquest. This created a horrifying form of technological diffusion, where advances in causing human suffering spread as rapidly and systematically as improvements in agriculture, medicine, or engineering. The impact of torture on family and community relationships demonstrates how these practices destroyed the social fabric of entire societies by making trust and normal human relationships impossible. When anyone could be accused of secret crimes and subjected to torture until they confessed, people became afraid to maintain close friendships, express unpopular opinions, or engage in any behavior that might be interpreted as suspicious. Parents lived in fear that their children might be tortured to extract confessions about family activities, while spouses and siblings were often forced to testify against each other under threat of torture themselves. The result was the creation of societies characterized by paranoia, isolation, and constant fear. The medical knowledge that informed torture practices reveals how healing professions became corrupted by institutional demands to participate in systematic cruelty. Physicians were often present during torture sessions to ensure that victims remained conscious and alive throughout their ordeals, while their medical expertise was used to determine how much pain particular individuals could endure before dying. Some doctors developed specialized knowledge about torture techniques and even wrote treatises on the most effective methods for inflicting pain without causing immediate death. This represented a complete perversion of medical ethics that turned healers into instruments of institutional violence. The role of popular culture and public entertainment in normalizing torture demonstrates how entire societies became conditioned to view extreme cruelty as acceptable and even enjoyable spectacle. Public torture sessions were often treated as festivals, with vendors selling food and drink while crowds gathered to watch innocent people being systematically brutalized. The torture and execution of supposed criminals became a form of mass entertainment that reinforced social hierarchies while providing psychological outlets for aggression and sadism. Children were brought to watch these events as educational experiences that would teach them about the consequences of challenging authority or deviating from social norms. The economic costs of maintaining torture-based legal systems reveal how enormous resources were devoted to institutions whose primary function was causing human suffering rather than promoting justice or social welfare. Specialized facilities had to be constructed and maintained for torture sessions, while professional torturers commanded significant salaries for their expertise. The courts that relied on torture-based confessions required elaborate bureaucratic structures to process the enormous caseloads generated by systems that treated suspicion as equivalent to guilt. These economic investments represented a massive misallocation of social resources that impoverished communities while enriching the institutions that profited from systematic cruelty. The psychological effects on torture victims who survived their ordeals provide heartbreaking evidence of how these practices destroyed human lives, even when they didn't result in immediate death. Survivors often suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, including persistent nightmares, flashbacks, and inability to maintain normal social relationships. Many developed chronic pain conditions related to their torture injuries, while others experienced psychological disorders that made it impossible for them to work or care for their families. The torture process was designed not just to extract confessions, but to permanently damage its victims in ways that would serve as ongoing warnings to other potential dissidents. The resistance movements that developed in response to systematic torture reveal how some individuals and communities attempted to protect themselves and their neighbors from institutional brutality. Secret networks were established to help accused individuals escape before they could be arrested, while some communities developed early warning systems that would alert residents when inquisitors or other torture-wielding authorities were approaching their areas. These resistance efforts were extremely dangerous, as anyone caught helping suspected heretics or criminals would themselves become targets for torture. But they demonstrate that not everyone accepted the legitimacy of torture-based justice systems. The legal theories that were developed to justify torturing innocent people reveal how sophisticated intellectual frameworks can be constructed to rationalize virtually any form of institutional cruelty. Legal scholars wrote detailed treatises arguing that torture was necessary for maintaining social order, protecting religious orthodoxy, and ensuring that justice was served in cases where conventional evidence was unavailable. They developed elaborate rules about who could be tortured, under what circumstances, and using which methods, creating the appearance of careful legal reasoning while systematically undermining any meaningful protection for individual rights or human dignity. The international diplomatic consequences of torture practices demonstrate how the systematic brutalization of innocent people eventually became a source of conflict and instability between different political entities. Countries that practiced torture extensively often found themselves in conflict with neighbors who refused to extradite suspects or cooperate with investigations that they knew would result in torture. The reputation for cruelty that developed around certain institutions and regions made diplomatic relations difficult while generating refugee crises as people fled areas where torture was commonly practiced. These international tensions ultimately contributed to military conflicts and political instability that harmed the very societies that torture was supposed to protect. The eventual decline of institutionalized torture came not through sudden moral awakening, but through gradual recognition that torture-based legal systems were counterproductive and destabilizing. As alternative methods of investigation and evidence gathering were developed, the practical necessity for torture became less obvious, while the social costs of maintaining torture-based institutions became harder to justify. The rise of enlightenment, thinking about individual rights and the nature of justice, provided intellectual frameworks for challenging torture, while political changes reduced the power of the institutions that had most enthusiastically practiced it. The modern legacy of historical torture practices continues to influence contemporary debates about criminal justice, national security, and the appropriate limits of state power. The techniques and justifications developed during the medieval and early modern periods have been repeatedly revived during times of political crisis, demonstrating that the capacity for systematic cruelty remains latent within human institutions and can be activated when fear and ideology override moral constraints. Understanding the historical context of torture helps explain how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic brutality while maintaining their sense of moral legitimacy and social responsibility. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of torturing innocent people reveals the extraordinary human capacity for creating institutional systems that systematically violate basic moral principles, while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and even righteousness. The torture chambers of the Inquisition were staffed not by obvious criminals or psychopaths, but by people who genuinely believed they were serving God, justice, and community welfare through their work. This demonstrates that good intentions and sincere beliefs are no guarantee against systematic cruelty, when they are channeled through institutions that lack adequate safeguards against abuse and that prioritize abstract goals over individual human welfare. What do you think about this absolutely terrifying demonstration of how legal and religious institutions can systematically torture innocent people while convincing themselves and their societies that they are serving noble purposes? Can you imagine living in a world where being accused of a crime was essentially equivalent to being convicted, and where the legal system was designed to extract confessions through pain rather than to determine actual guilt or innocence? The fact that entire societies could accept and even celebrate the torture of their innocent neighbors really makes you wonder about the psychological and social factors that enable institutional cruelty to flourish, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about what safeguards might prevent similar systematic abuse in our own time, and whether you think contemporary institutions might be engaging in practices that future generations will view with similar horror. If you found this investigation into how supposedly civilized societies justified torturing innocent people as disturbing and relevant as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about the historical patterns of institutional cruelty that continue to influence our world today. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will explore another historical example of how fear and ideology can transform ordinary people into instruments of systematic oppression. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional power forever.